Okay, so talking about the differential pressure controller. One side connects to upper deck, the other side is to manifold. The spring pressure holds it in normally closed position. Well, we kind of want it in a normally closed position because if it was normally open, that would be kind of sucky. It would already start draining off oil. So you don't want that. So you want it to start blocking oil. So when I'm sitting there on the ground and the engine is not running, then if this is normally closed, this is blocked off and this is blocked off, and it should be saying, hey, we need more turbo, because the turbo is not running, and these things aren't electronic. They're manually operated off of oil pressure. So they're both going to be saying more turbo. Thank you for doing that. I did not appreciate that. They're both going to be saying more turbo, and because they're both saying more turbo, that's great. It's going to be telling this to close. Well, of course, it's not going to be closing because I just said the engine's not running. If the engine's not running, then there's no oil pressure. So it's just going to be sitting there. But the minute I start up the aircraft and oil pressure starts to build up, these things are normally closed, and this is going to have oil pressure coming in through here, start to build up and start to close this until I build up the pressure, and then it's going to start working. So to finish that thought, so it's normally closed. What's going to open it? What is going to open it? So if the pressure differential from upper deck pressure, there, now I'm going to abbreviate, upper deck pressure to manifold pressure. So the difference between those two exceeds a set limit, and that's whatever the manufacturer wants it to be. The valve opens. Bleeding off oil pressure. Valve opens, bleeding off oil pressure, and opening wastegate, and opens wastegate. Opens wastegate, which would be less turbo. I'll put that less turbo. Oops, less turbo. There we go. And usually the set value for these things, is around 2 to 4 inches of mercury. And the reason behind this, I don't have this on here, but I'll put 5. Yeah. And all of this prevents something known as bootstrapping. At part throttle. I don't love the whole bootstrapping name, because the term bootstrapping comes from pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, which means to help yourself, which I think throttle sensitivity is a better word for it, because it clearly defines what it is, but they call it bootstrapping, where just a little bit of change causes the turbo to speed up, and it speeds up, and that causes a little more change and more change and more change, and you don't really want that. So that's why they have that there. All right, let's talk about, we'll just go through a little bit slower, what it looks like while it's operating, while it's actually running. So operation. So we got the engine running, so we'll say at part throttle. We'll start there at part throttle. At part throttle, the density controller is closed. Asking for more turbo, more pressure, right? we could say, why is it actually closed? Why is it asking for more pressure? Well, it's going to be really two reasons. One, because the density controller is doing its job. But if the density controller wasn't in the picture, then we kind of have to think about, and this is a good thing to do to see if you understand the system, then we sort of stop and think about, well, okay, then what would the density controller probably be seeing? Well, if I'm only at part throttle, maybe 1800 RPM, not spinning too fast, we could perhaps say that there's really not enough exhaust pressure to begin with to spin the turbo fast enough to even get it up to 40 inches of manifold pressure. Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the turbo and the system. And what's happening with it. Is it going into through the sonic venturi, trying to pressurize the cabin and the doors open? Who knows what's going on, right? So it's probably asking for more turbo. So it's doing that. Let me see, where am I here? Okay, yep. So, however, I'm going to move over now because I think everybody's probably got their notes written, and I can come up to here.
Can you go back just for a second?
You'll let me know when you're done, right? Were you taking a little long because you're in the shower? Uh-oh. Janet said don't do it, so.
Nope, right. I'm just slow at writing, trying to have good handwriting.
Let's talk about Daniel then. Daniel, are you eating corn on the cob, or what do you got there?
Cursive or something?
Looks pretty good. Oh, an orange.
So if you're not all the way, you're not at full throttle, it's just going to keep, the density controller is going to keep wanting it to feed more, like we were talking about earlier, like the 30 or 28 mix, where one's going to want more than the other, basically.
Nope. The density controller has no knowledge of the two. Density controller wants one thing and one thing only, and that's enough pressure to get full power.
Okay, it just keeps wanting more pressure.
It wants 40, it wants a full-on 40 inches of mercury. Let's just go with that.
Okay.
And if it doesn't get it, it's going to keep closed, asking for more because it wants 40. It's all it knows. It's kind of stupid about that. More power. Okay, can I move it now? I'm moving. All right, nobody imploded. Okay, so what else? So we'll make this point too. So point number one, part throttle density controller, unless it's got its full 40 inches, it's going to keep screaming for more. Well, it's not going to have 40 inches. I told you for two reasons. One, because it's not all alone in the system. The differential controller is going to be inside the system, and it's already taking over control because it's going to activate first, because really the density controller is more designed for full throttle operations. Here we are with the density controller over, the differential controller has already taken command of this system because it can. So the differential controller, meanwhile, the density controller, nope, don't want to say density controller. Don't want to say that. Does start with a D. The differential controller, senses the difference between upper deck and manifold pressure. So remember, over on the left side, we could say that we got the density controller is saying, give me more, but it's not involved in the system right now because the differential has actually got priority over it, if you will, at this point, because it is open. And it is already starting to drain off oil because it is sensing the difference between the upper deck and the manifold pressure. And let me see. And because, remember, we're part throttle, and because there is a large difference difference in pressure, or more than, if this is set for 2 to 4, more than 4, it's fine, is a large difference in pressure across the throttle plate. Wow, I'm just not really doing the job with the writing today. Across the throttle plate. All right, differential controller senses the difference between upper deck and manifold pressure. And because there's a large difference in pressure across the throttle plate, it's going to do a couple of things. One, it's sensing that difference. It doesn't want that difference. If there's this big difference in there, we're going to have bootstrapping, or as I said, throttle sensitivity. Don't want it. So this is going to take command, and this will cause this. Well, I wrote this allows the differential controller to adjust the wastegate. Well, we'll go with that. This allows the differential controller to adjust the wastegate, to adjust. And it is going to say less turbo, less turbo. Why is it saying less turbo? Because we're at part throttle and there's this too large of a difference between the manifold and the upper deck. You don't want the large difference. Why don't you want the large difference? Because you get bootstrapping, you get throttle sensitivity. So this helps control, this helps control bootstrapping. Oops, B-O-O-T. Throttle sensitivity. All right, so hopefully you see what's going on right there, what's happening with this. And it's just as the picture shows it. And this is where we're at. Part throttle, we have too much pressure has built up across here. We have more than 2 to 4 inches of mercury. More than 2 to 4 inches across here. So the differential controller, which is normally spring loaded to the closed position to block off any oil pressure, is saying, wait a minute, we have too much pressure. The pressure builds up. We can look at it like this and say the pressure builds up and the blue is higher and it pushes down and opens up the valve, which then allows oil to drain off. So now oil is draining off from here and the wastegate is going to start to open up, which is going to let less air flow through here across the turbine wheel, which will slow down this and decrease the upper deck pressure. Meanwhile, what is the density controller saying? Well, a minute ago it was saying, hey, I don't have enough pressure. Guess what it's saying now? Hey, I don't have enough pressure. Because all it wants is it's 40 inches. It's all it knows. It's all it cares about. But that's why we put the differential control over here, because it has a little more brains to the operation. This is the brains. This is the brawn, I guess. So the brains of the operation say, nope, we don't want that pressure. So start bleeding off. All right. What else we got? We can go this way. As throttle is opened, the pressure drop. I shouldn't say pressure drop. I should say pressure differential. Pressure differential across the throttle is reduced to a point where there is only a small difference, where there is only a small difference. I don't know what happened there. Small difference. And differential controller. No longer has control. No longer has control.
So Kevin.
Yeah.
Was it looking for a equilibrium too, or you know the differential?
Say it again.
Is it looking for equilibrium, like the carburetors and the or
No, no, it's a lot more simplistic than that. It's not at all equilibrium. It doesn't care. So it'll actually move too far one way and too far the other. Oh, I don't know. I mean, to a point, yeah, I guess it does find an equilibrium between the spring pressure and the green and the blue on the other side. So yeah, it does, I should say, the more I think about it. But it's really not something you have to consider. But it does find a little happy spot where it's just running along there. All right, so where we've got it right now is, I don't really have a slide that represents that, but let me see here. We use the pen. So what's happening now is because the throttle is now open, there's very little difference between the green and the blue. So we could say this is running at 40 inches now, wide open, and this is at 39. Why not? We'll say it had a 1 inch drop across the throttle plate. So it's running at 39. This is set to control it, keep it between no more than 2 to 4. So it's saying, hey, I'm less than 2 to 4. I'm happy. Let's go ahead and shut down here. It's good. So it does not care anymore. So it's shut down because the pressure is equal. And because the pressure is nearly equal, that with the spring pressure has closed this, right? So it's normally closed anyway because of the spring pressure. So it's closed off. But now this one sees 40 and it is going to open up and start letting oil bleed off, even though my oil is red and not yellow. So it's going to start bleeding off. But in theory, only a point to where we can use Hector's term to find equilibrium, which is not bad, which means that the wastegate doesn't have to be fully closed or fully open, but it actually finds some happy medium spot right there in the middle where it says, yep, that's where I want to be. I don't know what it's going to be. It's going to be at some spot, which pretty much puts the whole thing kind of sort of in equilibrium. It's going to move a little bit back and forth. This is going to move a little bit back and forth. It just does. And, but you may not even notice it. And so there it is. We're running wide open throttle and it's happy. So as we go up in altitude, now what's going to happen is, if this thing isn't fully open as we go up in altitude, then it's going to sense a decrease in upper deck pressure. As we sense the decrease in upper deck pressure, what it's going to do is it's going to start blocking off a little bit more oil and start opening this thing up just a little bit more. It's going to go open a little more, a little more, a little more as we keep going at altitude to some point where it is in fact fully wide open. And it's fully wide open. At that point, we continue to climb and we start losing fully open, and we start losing my 40 inches right here, and this goes down to 39. That's called critical altitude. Ta-da. Let's see. So I'll say this 4 says throttle is open. The pressure differential across the throttle is reduced to a point where there is only a small difference and differential controller no longer has control. Why? Because it's closed. It's saying more turbo, but too late. But at that point, the density controller takes over. So at this point, the density controller then takes over. And then very basically, if upper deck pressure is too high, oil is bled off. And if upper deck pressure is too low, oil return is blocked. All right, did everybody get caught up on this one? Eric, you good? Janet, she's good. Everybody's good. All right. Daniel's still writing. Or maybe he's cutting his orange. I don't know. All right, so we'll shift gears just a little bit. Let's talk about some of the problems, which we really have, but now that you understand the system, they might make a little more sense. So one, throttle sensitivity. Throttle sensitivity. All right, first of all, turbo systems respond slowly. Systems respond slowly. R-E-S-P-O-N, respond slowly. And if you kind of think about that whole system, and as we're looking at it and we go through it, we're realizing that the whole thing is responding on oil pressure and how long that actually takes to go through the system. So we can even look at just we can look at the differential controller. So I move my throttle a little bit, and the difference between the upper deck and manifold changes, the pressure changes. And so the density controller is going to recognize that. So it's going to move to block some oil pressure. Well, now the oil pressure has to build up, and it has to move the old rusty wastegate in there, because they always look old and rusty. And so it's got to move that, and then it moves that, and then it may move it a little bit too much, and then it's got to go back and readjust, and it just goes this back and forth till it finally finds a spot where it kind of likes, and then hey, there it is. And by then you've either changed altitude or done something that changes the whole thing. So it removes rather slowly. So keep that in mind. So and I can write that. Pilot opens throttle, which establishes a new differential. A new differential. Oh, we'll say pressure. New differential pressure. All right, so that happens. So pilot just moved it. Now we have new differential pressure. Well, so the differential controller, so the differential controller senses the change and repositions its own bleed valve. Senses the change and repositions the bleed valve. All right, so now you got that going on. Okay, so now that happens, the new bleed setting, changes oil flow from the wastegates. A new bleed setting changes oil flow from wastegate. All right, so now you've had this change in the wastegate. Now the wastegate changes position. Change the position and increases, or in this case, we'll say increases turbo speed. Right, so now it increased the turbo speed. Well, that was good because it's kind of what it wanted to happen, but the increased turbo speed increased upper deck pressure, which then increases and manifold pressure at the same time, which increases upper deck pressure and manifold pressure. I'm not going to go much further with this one, so don't freak out. All right. So that then increase the turbo speed, which increases upper deck pressure, which then of course does have a change in manifold pressure, which then has a change in the differential between the two. So I could put that, which changes the difference, the DIF. which changes the difference between the two. All right, well, now we have a change in the difference between two. Guess what happens? The differential controller has to move again. So now the differential controller now the differential controller must adjust again, starting the process all over. And we go right back to the start, where the differential, well, not quite the start, back to 2. Now the differential controller senses the change and repositions the bleed valve. The new bleed valve setting changes the overflow of the wastegate, and the wastegate has changed position. And so, you know, it keeps going over and over. I don't honestly know how cars are doing it right now. My assumption, of course, is it's all done very much electronically with something that is a rapidly positioned based upon throttle position, inputs, and all other things. So it's all probably computer controlled. This is not. So it's a much slower thing. So, all right, let's see. I don't want D, I want B because I did A. So let me B. Wonder if there's a way I can make this more simple, but every time I try to make something a little more simplistic and easier, I think I leave out stuff. So let's talk about not I, but bootstrapping. Bootstrapping. And we know that that is defined as a throttle sensitivity. So if the differential controller was not operating, so if we took it out of the system and we said, hey, we're just going to rely on a density controller, in theory, it would work, right? Because you're just going to use the throttle positioning to try and control your manifold pressure, but it would be extremely sensitive. So if the differential controller, differential controller was not operating, or I should say not in the system, any increase in throttle would cause an increase in turbo speed. Which is kind of a good thing, but if I only open the throttle a little tiny bit, then I really wouldn't necessarily need an increase in turbo speed, because I probably have more than enough pressure in the upper deck to handle anything that I want, all the way up to and including full throttle. So let's just say I'm at 65% throttle and I go to 75. Well, I'm sitting here at 65 and I'm holding back the pressure. Upper deck is already set at 40. Upper deck's saying, let's go, man. I'm ready. I'm full throttle capable right now. Let's go. And you're like, well, I'm only at 65 and I want to go to 75. So I squeak open the throttle just a little tiny bit and have this massive rush of air inside, or even some air, which then is going to cause the turbo to speed up even more. And thankfully the density controller is going to block it at 40, but otherwise it wouldn't. And so this whole time I've just got way too much manifold pressure. So this causes, or at least tries to cause, an increase in upper deck pressure and then manifold pressure without a throttle change. So if you kind of follow my thought through, because I added without a throttle change, I'll put down little parentheses. So as the pilot, I've only changed the throttle a little bit and I've let go of the throttle. Okay, I'm not touching it now. So I've moved my throttle a little bit. That caused a small increase in manifold pressure. The small increase in manifold pressure caused my engine to speed up. Because of the engine speed up, caused, or if I have constant speed prop, it won't speed up, but I'm going to have more air flowing through. Higher manifold pressure, that causes more exhaust. More exhaust causes the turbo to speed up. The turbo just sped up. Now it's going to start feeding more air into the upper deck and more air into the manifold, even though I didn't touch anything. So I wait a second, and all of a sudden this thing starts running away from me. I'm like, well, crap, now I got to try pulling it back a little bit. So now I got to pull it back a little bit and throttle back from the throttle setting I had that was fine a minute ago. Now it's not fine. So that's why they call it bootstrapping, and it creates this huge mess. So I guess I could keep going. Well, it's not too bad.
So it's like it has like a delay, right?
Yep, there's a delay. So let me see. This increases horsepower. This increases horsepower / RPM. I say horsepower / RPM because remember and we'll talk next. Coming up is props. The prop is going to hold the RPM there, but you get an increase in horsepower because you had an increased manifold pressure. This causes an increase in exhaust flow. This increases turbo speed, which causes a chain reaction. And the whole thing starts going again. So there's your bootstrapping. And you don't want that, obviously.
What would happen if you had some sort of oil blockage in one of these systems?
More turbo, which is a really good question. So if we had something that made it through the oil system and a blockage, well, if it blocks it right here, then you're stuck with this thing wide open. Because remember, it's spring loaded to wide open. And if you got it wide open, then you have no turbo. So, but if we get a blockage here or here, then that particular controller is going to shut down and say more turbo. So it would default towards more turbo down here.
So if one of the systems is blocked, the other one can't kind of compensate for it enough?
Not really. Well, okay, so let's take a look. If the differential pressure is blocked, then we just go back to what I said a few points ago, and that is that, well, then you're going to have super sensitive throttle and bootstrapping because the differential is not working anymore. And so you're going to rely on the density. If the density controller was blocked, you probably wouldn't really know it until you went wide open throttle. Then at that point, you'd actually pick it up. You'd say, wow, hey, why am I at 50 inches of manifold pressure here? I'm supposed to be at 40. That's not good. Which brings me to my next point. C,
Okay.
overboost. There are service bulletins, instructions, and things that talk about overboost. Overboost is a very bad thing. Overboost is defined when manifold pressure exceeds manufacturer's limits. Manufacturer limits. Let me think. It can happen due to the time it takes for components to react. It takes for components to react because it reacts slow. I'll say react to throttle changes, to throttle. It's more prone to happen on manual systems. And it's also 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. Can happen with fast pilot inputs. All right, so
Like the Ferrari.
What's that?
Like the Ferrari.
Yeah, exactly. Except the system saved me on that one. It had the pop-off valves went off. All right, so I'm going to write this. We'll kind of compare and contrast too. That is, there's another thing called overshoot. And that is
when you miss the runway.
What's that?
You miss the runway?
No, that looks like overshoot. And that is a momentary overboost due to system lag, So really, I would say almost point number 2 and point number 4 here, they really fall more into an overshoot category. I think overshoot's more likely to happen on those things because we're just talking about time it takes for something to react. Then that's more of an overshoot. It's not likely that you're going to see an overboost, a long period of overboost, because of the time that it takes a component to react. So I should almost write those more down there. So let me see. That's almost a better point down there. Make my notes. There. Can happen with fast pilot input. So in theory, and hopefully, you'll just get this overshoot. And I don't have, let me see, do I have this one? No, you know what we talked about this stuff? We talked a lot about this stuff when we talked about back in 310, when we talked about overspeed and overboost. And that's where we got into that. So I don't have to recover it. But if you remember, there was a period of time, I believe it was 3 seconds for Lycoming. So anything that was over 3 seconds was considered an overboost. Anything under 3 seconds was overshoot. And so depending on how bad you overshot it or how bad you overboosted and how long it was what you had to do. If it would range anywhere from you had to do a log entry and correct the situation all the way up to complete disassembly and tear down of the engine and reinspect. So there was the whole, obviously, gamut of it, what you had to do in there. So, but just be aware of those things, and that's what you have to do. So
didn't one of them require the replacement of the crankshaft?
Yeah, I believe it got bad enough. It did. I think that was on the helicopter engines by chance. Helicopter engines were much more prone to this problem. All right, what do we got next here? How's everybody doing? Caught up? Caught up. All right.
Not yet, not yet.
Janet says she's good. See, that's the great thing about Janet being the last one to talk. Every time I look down, I go, I'm good. She said she's good, so I can move on. And I think I'm almost out of paper, so this would be a good time to.
Steve is the new Janet.
What?
Well, it's because I'm really trying to take proper notes and like I'm working really hard to write slowly.
Well, good. I'm happy to hear that. Okay, let's talk about our next system. Our next system. This would be C, big C, variable pressure controller system. Variable pressure controller. This one is actually used on the TIO 541. I liked the TIO 541s. It really wasn't that it was bigger than the TIO 540. They, among other things, the cylinders had oil-cooled exhaust guides, and I thought those were pretty cool. They had a little passageway that would go around them, if I remember correctly. All right, what does this one do? Well, it replaces the density. This variable pressure replaces the density and differential controller. Let's pull up a picture here. Hopefully I have one. Let's see. There we go. All right, so we're gonna be talking about over here on the left right now. Next one's gonna be, oh, I'm sorry, we're talking about variable pressure controller. It's the whole thing. All right, so the variable pressure controller, 2 diagrams. Which one should we look at here? How about the one on the left? We can look over here on the left. Laser pointer. All right, so have our laser pointer. Things look pretty much the same, right? So I've got ambient air in, we got the turbo controller, nothing's changed. I got my Y gate, looks the same. I got my exhaust, my wastegate looks the same. Oil in, oil out, going to a controller, oil drain back. Only difference is here now, I've got a component here, a variable controller. I've got a pressure relief valve and a sonic venturi. So everybody should remember when I see sonic venturi, that's simply part of the aircraft pressurization system, right? And so it's shaped that way to limit the amount of pressurization that is available for the pressurization for cabin and leaves some over here. So again, dissecting, what are we looking at? Here's my throttle plate right here. So I'm gonna come over here and look at it and go, okay, my variable controller is sensing what? It's right here, it's sensing upper deck pressure on this side. We can come over here to more of a breakdown and take a look at what we have. And we can see that we should have engine, get heads or tails. Okay, compressor coming in. I've got my engine going through, wastegate out. That's kind of how they did it. Here's my upper deck pressure. Remember, this is a sensor, so it's just sensing upper deck pressure. They just have it on a line coming up over here. Same thing. So I've got upper deck pressure here. What else are we sensing right here? We've got engine oil supply comes through, goes out. All right, so fine. So it really matches this one. It senses one air pressure, and that is upper deck pressure. Let's take a look at this. What the heck is going on here? All right, this is kind of cool, and I like that. This is a cam that is linked to the throttle. Of course, it should say that somewhere. Yeah, it's linked to the throttle. So it is tied into throttle like we saw with one of the manual systems, but instead of just being a purely mechanical wastegate that's controlled running this over here, the wastegate, it's going to run it through a controller that's going to vary the spring pressure that is placed on the variable pressure controller. So if you think about that, you can kind of start to think, hey, that kind of makes sense, because rather than taking a whole nother controller that's sensing the difference between these two pressures, we can kind of pre-program this and say, well, hey, look, we know that at a given position that it's going to be part throttle. So let's just tell this thing with the spring, it's part throttle. It kind of knows that. So that's really what's going on with that thing. So it's, you just lose a controller, and then you've got to let this one, we manually control the spring pressure. But we're going to add this in it. And this, we can actually change it. It's a pressure relief valve. We could call it the safety pressure relief valve if we want. And that's what I heard on the Ferrari, I believe. So just in case, because now we don't have two brains, we only have one brain. And because of that, if this particular item right here were to get, let's say it wants more pressure, and it shouldn't have more pressure. My pressure relief valve over here is going to pop off and just drain out any excessive pressure that we have. And how am we doing on time? Well, 5:20, I think this is a good spot for a break, and we can come back and revisit this one.